Richard Oswald in the 18th century's Atlantic trade. Let's begin with two quick stories. The first takes place in Worcester, England on November 21st, 1741. A soap boiler named Samuel Lucas walks into a grocery store and buys 2 pounds of Hyson tea, a fine green tea from China. The grocer weighs it and wraps it, and neither man really pauses to consider what it took to get those leaves to England. A few years later, Earl Horace Walpole joins 2,000 people in one of London's gardens to celebrate the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. He comments on the French horns and the harlequins and the gondolas in the canal and the people dancing around the maypole, but he doesn't comment on all of the booths that were serving tea and sugar. And he certainly doesn't pause to think about how those merchants obtained their merchandise. Indeed, most people in 18th century Britain did not realize the enormous complexities involved in bringing sugar and tea to a grocery store or garden party. But there were those who most certainly did, men like global merchant Richard Oswald. Oswald was born in 1705, 2 years before the Act of Union formally united England and Scotland and formed the United Kingdom. He grew up in Caithness, the most northerly and quite impoverished shire of mainland Britain, where his father served as a Presbyterian minister. As a boy, Oswald was homeschooled since the nearest statutory school was impractically far away. At 20, he heeded the call of urban life and moved to Glasgow to clerk for his two older cousins, whose firm specialized in Virginia tobacco. Their business was substantial. By 1731, it ranked as the fifth largest tobacco firm in Glasgow, importing over 300,000 pounds of the Chesapeake leaf a year. Oswald developed his commercial instincts by doing the firm's bookkeeping. And he must have been a quick study. By the 1730s, his cousins trusted him to manage their operations on the American side of the Atlantic. Oswald spent most of his 6 years in the Americas in Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk served as a depot or an entrepot for tidewater planters who exported tobacco, grain, salted meat, timber, and animal skins to Britain. Tobacco was Norfolk's primary commodity, and Glasgow served as the crop's primary destination. As his cousin's American agent, Oswald was responsible for selling supplies to the planters and negotiating the purchase price for their crop. The industry was tightly regulated, with the colonial government requiring government inspection of all tobacco before its export. Only first growth leaves from each plant were sellable, and all the tobacco had to be properly dried in barns like these. Colonial officials burned tobacco that failed to meet inspection, and these policies sought to control the market and keep prices high. It was very much a mercantilist approach to economic trade. Oswald returned to Glasgow in 1741. In recognition of his American work, he was made a partner in his cousin's firm, and he immediately began to advocate for expanding the firm's scope by selling an additional commodity, sugar. His timing was excellent, for over the course of the 18th century, British sugar consumption grew enormously, as you can see from the slide. This was largely because customers increasingly wanted to have sugar with their tea. Indeed, by mid-century, sugar was consumed by all social classes. Demand had become so great that Britain's Caribbean possessions could not keep up with the demand. And Oswald understood how to profit by supplying this insatiable appetite. In mid-1746, Oswald moved to London and leased a narrow 4-story Georgian townhouse on Philpot Lane that may have looked something like this. It was near the city's commercial heart, and it contained offices, living quarters, and storage. It was from here that Oswald set out to build the commercial network that would define his career. London's business community proved hostile to Scots, however. Oswald found it extraordinarily difficult to penetrate the existing personal networks which are seen at work here at the Royal Exchange. He turned instead to his fellow Scots who had come into the city in search of fortune, men who shared his ambition and his middling background. Together, Oswald and his five closest associates committed to a strategy of eliminating middlemen and controlling the means of production. They bought their own ships, they hired their own personnel, contracted their own agents, and in 1748 they purchased an island in West Africa. Banks Island is a 15-acre islet in the Sierra Leone River that had a history as a slave trading post. Grant, Oswald and Company purchased it in July 1748. Oswald and his partners invested heavily in the island's infrastructure. By 1756, its fort walls had been reinforced, its cannons had increased in size and number, and his white workforce had grown from 10 to 35 employees, making it one of the more established and secure British settlements in West Africa. Oswald and his partners also revised the operational model of the slave trade in two ways. First, they maintained peaceful relations with local African chiefs rather than raiding local communities. Oswald's agents were forbidden from kidnapping or making war on local tribes. The company relied instead on those tribes to supply enslaved people in exchange for guns, gunpowder, alcohol, fabrics, and other goods in the one-by-one barter transactions. Secondly, rather than having ship captains wait offshore for months while their holds filled, Banks Island kept a standing inventory of enslaved people so that ships could load and depart quickly, thereby saving time, cutting mortality, and commanding premium prices. It is difficult to use a word like inventory when talking about people, but the reality is that for Oswald and for other slave traders, Africans were simply another commodity to be traded, little different than tobacco or sugar or guns. The questions that kept them up at night were not concerned with the ethics of brutally uprooting millions of human beings. Rather, what concerned Oswald and his kin were simply the economic considerations. This orientation meant that between 1748 and 1784, Grant, Oswald and Company purchased no fewer than 12,929 individuals. The 33 voyages completed by the Oswald-owned or partially owned ships between 1752 and 1787 had a 13.41% mortality rate, higher than the British average. Survivors of what is known as the Middle Passage faced exceptional trauma, humiliation, violence, and the psychological effects of being surrounded for weeks by pestilent air, unbearable crowding, and death. Profits from slaving were real but not exceptional, between 6 and 10%. This was similar to other commercial ventures of the era. Clearly, it was not necessary for a mid-18th century merchant to engage in human trafficking to make a profit. This makes Oswald's choice to do so all that much more troubling. Oswald's operations embodied the Atlantic commercial system at its most well engineered. His ships could follow the classic triangular route from Britain to Africa with trade goods, from Africa to the Americas with enslaved people, and from the Americas back to Britain with agricultural commodities. But there were lots of other options and ventures that worked as well. The sloop Carlisle provides a clear example of how the traditional triangular trade worked. It left London in February of 1756 with European and Asian trade goods. It purchased 35 enslaved people along the Senegalese Gambia coast, and it collected 158 more at Banks Island. Then it crossed the Atlantic, headed for Charleston, South Carolina, where it arrived with 150 survivors, and that was a 22% mortality rate on the Middle Passage. In Charleston, then called Charlestown, Oswald relied on a trusted local agent by the name of Henry Lawrence. Oswald paid Lawrence a 9% commission on each sale and offered him exclusive rights to sell the enslaved people shipped from Banks Island to the British colonies. Oswald valued Lawrence for his financial honesty and his business savvy. After the sale of slaves, Lawrence loaded the Carlisle with South Carolinian rice for the final leg back to London. Not all of Oswald's voyages followed this traditional triangle. Ships also ran directly between Charleston and Sierra Leone, for example, but the commercial logic was constant. Control every link in the chain in order to minimize costs and maximize profits. The Atlantic trade was only part of Oswald's portfolio. In 1758, he won a contract to supply bread to the British Army fighting in the 7 Years' War in Germany. He moved to Germany with his wife and set up his own bakeries and supply depots and ground his own flour. He offered the British Army a below-market rate initially, but once that contract came to term, Oswald boosted prices with a markup of 143%. By the end of the war in 1763, Oswald made £112,000 on bread alone, enough for Scottish poet Robert Burns to call him the plunderer of armies. Oswald's one significant failure came when he invested in a Florida plantation. Oswald secured 20,000 acres south of St. Augustine and built what was called Mount Oswald using enslaved laborers, some of whom came from Banks Island. But the land was poorly drained, unsuited for sugarcane and indigo that he wanted to grow, and lacked reliable harbor access. Lawrence had warned him repeatedly not to buy the land, and the plantation never turned a profit. A slave rebellion in 1767 resulted in the murder of its overseer, and Oswald lost a lot of money. It was the only poor business decision of Oswald's life. Oswald is not a particularly well-known figure, but he did serve as Great Britain's chief negotiator at the peace talks that ended the American Revolution. When the negotiations began in Paris in 1782, Oswald was 77 years old, blind in one eye and hard of hearing. He was selected, however, because of his long familiarity with the colonies and because Benjamin Franklin trusted him. Here we see Franklin and John Adams discussing terms with Oswald, who was seated on the right. The negotiations were slow and fraught, complicated by divisions within both the American and the British delegations, and again between the British and the French. The French, remember, were the ones who made the American victory possible. But Oswald concluded early on that Britain should deal with the Americans, quote, tenderly as supposed conciliated friends, instead of in harsh terms that would only push the Americans closer to France. On November 30th, 1782, Oswald and the American commissioners signed the preliminary Articles of Peace at a hotel in Paris, setting the borders of the United States, securing navigation rights on the Mississippi, granting fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, and calling for the withdrawal of British troops. Late in the talks, Henry Lawrence, who was on the American team along with Franklin, Adams, and John Jay, added a final clause stipulating that British troops had to leave without, quote, carrying away any Negroes or other property. This provision was rooted directly in Lawrence's pre-war business dealings in the slave trade with Oswald, as well as the importance of slavery to the Southern economy. And so, yet another one of the United States' founding documents is tainted with racism. Richard Oswald died at a Scottish estate in 1784. When his wife died 2 years later, Oswald's nephews took over his affairs, including the ownership of Banks Island. They refurbished its facilities, resumed the slave trade with the same energy of their uncle, and continued shipping enslaved Africans across the Atlantic until 1811, which was 4 years after Parliament outlawed the trade. Oswald's career illuminates how the 18th century Atlantic economy actually worked. not as a set of separate trades in tobacco and sugar and enslaved people, but as a single integrated system in which the same merchants, the same ships, and the same capital moved fluidly between commodities, continents, and conflicts. The soap boiler buying tea in Worcester and the Earl sipping it in a London garden were the endpoints of a web that ran through Glasgow counting houses, Sierra Leone river estuaries, South Carolinian auction blocks, and German army bakeries. And Richard Oswald sat at the center of it all. Thank you.